My father taught me that every town has its own rhythm, a pulse you feel in your bones before your eyes adjust to the light. He never called it listening to the breath of a place, but that was how it lived inside me after he was gone. Stand still 3 seconds after you kill the engine, he used to say. Let the wind and the metal and the voices settle. A town that's hiding something will tighten around you like a fist. One that's lonely will open its hands. I carried those words with me the morning I drove the silver gray truck down the long approach to Black Creek. The high plains stretched out hills the color of scorched wheat fences running like dark stitches across the land. Power lines hummed overhead. Old pickups shared the road with horses. Phones glowed in calloused hands. Black Creek was the kind of place where 2 centuries refused to choose which one should win. I had taken over the route 3 months after my father's heart stopped on the shoulder of another empty highway. Everyone expected me to sell it. The logbooks, the contacts, the quiet understanding he had built with half the county, all of it could have become cash and a simpler life. Instead, I kept driving. At first, it was habit. Later, it became the only shape my days still recognized. This was my third solo trip. The town met me with its usual sounds hammers, ringing from the garage, the feed store bell crows, arguing on the streetlights, loud laughter spilling from the copper nail even before noon. I unloaded at the first 3 stops without trouble. Faces nodded at me because my jaw and my gray eyes belonged to Henry Vale. Some offered condolences again, as if 3 months had not been enough time for the words to lose their edges. Stone Creek waited 6 miles west past the Iron Bridge and the Needlegrass Flats. The black steel gate still carried the same faded sign, Thorne Land and Livestock. I eased the truck along the gravel lane tires, crunching the same stones my father's tires had pressed for 15 years. The farm unfolded with quiet competence. Barns stood tall and practical. Hay was stacked in precise rows. Water troughs ran on their own timers. Cameras watched from the roof corners like patient eyes. Nothing wasted, nothing for show. The main house sat low against the land, its long porch facing the pastures, and a crescent pond that caught the September light like a blade. I cut the engine. Boots sounded behind the nearest barn, steady, unhurried. Then she stepped into view. Braa Thorne was taller than I remembered from the few photos my father had shown me years ago. Her green skin carried the deep tone of someone who worked under every kind of sky. Shoulders broad from real labor, back straight, arms corded with the kind of strength that comes from lifting, pulling, and refusing to let go. Black hair threaded with silver was braided tight and pinned low. Her face was all angles and quiet certainty. The small tusks at the corners of her jaw only sharpened the impression that she had already measured the world and found most of it wanting. Denim shirt rolled to the elbows, jeans worn soft at the knees, thick leather belt boots crusted with dried earth. A braided cord circled her left wrist, dark with age and use. She stopped a few paces away and studied me the way she might study a new piece of machinery, careful, unblinking. "You have his eyes," she said. The voice was low, rough at the edges, shaped by wind and long silences. I nodded. "People keep telling me that. Not the whole face." She tilted her head slightly. "Your mouth doesn't hurry into a smile the way his did. You weigh your words first." I offered my hand. "Adrian Vale." She took it. Her grip was warm, dry, and stronger than most men I knew. Braa Thorne. My father delivered here the first week of every month. He did. I kept the route. "I know. You read the obituary. I did." The directness left a small silence between us. I gestured toward the truck. "Same order as always. I'll unload in the right shed." She walked ahead. We worked without unnecessary talk. I separated the seed sacks, kept the veterinary supplies shaded, checked every box. When I found a carton of pump bearings with a crushed corner, I set it aside. "Rocky stretch before the bridge," I explained. "I'll bring a perfect replacement next month." No charge. Braa opened the carton, ran her fingers over the pieces, then closed it again. The internals look sound. "Noted as inspected and accepted for now. If anything fails, we replace it. If not, we forget it happened." I met her gaze. "That how you keep accounts straight? That's how I make sure nothing owns me that I didn't choose to owe." We finished the rest of the load in the same measured rhythm. When the last pallet was stacked, she signed the digital receipt with one thick finger. I was already thinking about the long drive back when she spoke again. "Henry used to sit on the back porch before he left. Coffee, black, no sugar." I hesitated. He drank it everywhere. Not here. A faint shift in her tone, almost gentle. Here he stayed a while. She glanced at the house. Pot's still hot, if you're not rushing off. I should have declined. The schedule was tight. The road waited. But something in the way she said it, quiet without pressure, pulled at the hollow place my father's death had carved behind my ribs. I followed her around the side of the house. The back porch overlooked the pastures and the pond. Wind moved through dry grass carrying the scent of warm soil and distant cattle. Braa set a heavy brown mug in front of me. Steam rose in slow spirals. I wrapped both hands around it, feeling the heat travel up my arms. She sat across from me, elbows on her knees, the leather cord on her wrist catching the light. I took a sip. Bitter, strong, exactly right. He hated sugar. Said it dulled the mind. We drank in silence for a moment. Then she asked, "What did he tell you about this place?" I thought about the nights he came home late, boots still dusty, talking more to the kitchen table than to me. He said Stone Creek was different, that the woman who ran it didn't waste words or trust easy. Braa looked out at the pond. He was right about the trust part. I felt the weight of the next question before I spoke it. What did he tell you about me? She considered her answer longer than I expected. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped even lower. He told me about the 14-year-old who hid in the truck to chase waffles at a fair 200 miles away. Said you earned every mile of the scolding you got on the way home. A pause. He also told me about the day you stopped the rig in the middle of nowhere because you saw a hawk with a broken wing. You wouldn't drive on until you knew it was safe. I stared into my coffee. The mug suddenly felt heavier. He remembered the things that showed him who you might become. I swallowed. The grief I thought I had packed down tight shifted again, sharper than before. My father had kept pieces of me alive in conversations I had never been part of. The realization settled somewhere deep behind my sternum, warm and painful at once. I looked up. Your turn. She raised an eyebrow. He always traded one story for another. Said the miles felt shorter that way? Braa studied me for a long beat, then nodded once. 11 years ago, this land was nothing but cracked dirt and a dying well. The previous owner wanted to sell it cheap to a logistics outfit. I bought it with every cent I had and a loan that made bankers laugh behind my back. First year, I drilled for water 3 times and missed. On the 4th try, I climbed down into the hole myself, stood knee-deep in mud, and pointed at a wet streak in the stone. Told the crew to drill right there. They laughed louder than the bankers had. She took a slow breath. 3 days later, the water came up so hard it sounded like the ground itself had been holding its breath for years. I waited. People called it luck, she continued. I called it refusing to quit when every reasonable person would have. The wind moved across the porch. For a moment, the only sound was the distant lowing of cattle and the soft clink of my mug against the wooden rail. I told her another story then about the time my father traded an entire case of coffee for one star-shaped donut because my mother had once mentioned loving them as a girl. About how he hated odd numbers so much he would break the 3rd cookie in half. About the way he tapped the steering wheel twice before starting the engine every single time, as if greeting an old friend. Braa listened without interrupting, without offering sympathy or judgment. She simply took each memory and turning it over in her mind the way she had turned over those pump bearings earlier. When I finished, the sun had slid lower. Shadows stretched long across the pasture. The pond caught the light and held it like something precious. I stood. I should get back on the road. She rose 2 taller than me by half a head, solid as the land she had fought to keep. Drive careful, Adrian Vale. I walked to the truck, climbed in, started the engine. In the rearview mirror, she remained on the porch, one hand resting on the rail, the other still holding her mug. She didn't wave. She didn't need to. I told myself on the long drive out that the strange pull I felt was only grief wearing a new face. Only the echo of my father's footsteps on someone else's porch. Only the quiet of a place that had known him better than I sometimes had. None of those explanations felt true by the time the lights of Black Creek disappeared behind me. The road ahead stretched empty and familiar, but something inside my chest had already begun to shift, slow, stubborn, and impossible to name. October brought the first bite of autumn wind across the high plains, sharp enough to cut through denim and remind every ranch hand that the easy months were behind them. I rolled into Black Creek on schedule, the truck heavier with oil drums and mineral blocks. The town felt the same, yet different familiar sounds, layered over something quieter, like it had decided to watch me more closely now that I was no longer just Henry Vale's shadow. Stone Creek looked unchanged from the outside, but I noticed small things as I eased down the gravel lane, a fresh patch of concrete near the equipment shed, one of the cameras newly angled toward the southern pasture. Braa was already waiting by the unloading bay, clipboard in hand, her braid tighter than last time, sleeves rolled high on arms that carried the kind of strength earned one heavy lift at a time. We worked in the rhythm we had started last month, quick checks, quiet confirmations. When the last crate was stacked, I spotted the generator on the porch steps, its cover propped open like a broken jaw. The machine coughed when she tried at a high metallic whine that set my teeth on edge. "Sounds like the bearings are shot," I said, already reaching for the toolbox I kept behind the driver's seat. Braa watched me without protest. "I plan to call a mechanic next week." "I'm here now." She handed me a rag without being asked. I worked in silence while she stood nearby passing wrenches before I could name them. 15 minutes later, the engine settled into a steady thrum. I wiped grease from my hands and stepped back. "Should hold until you replace the whole assembly." She listened to the sound a moment longer, then nodded once. "Stay for lunch. Consider it payment for the unscheduled repair." The meal was simple, spiced smoked meat, cornbread crisp at the edges, pickles sharp enough to wake the dead. We ate at the kitchen table, the window framing a stretch of pasture turning gold under the midday sun. Between bites, she spoke first this time. 6 years ago, a late blizzard hit. Lightning spooked the herd near the western fence line. By morning, everything was accounted for except an old cow named Moth. One of the newer hands said she was ancient anyway, not worth the risk. I went out anyway. I waited, Fork paused, found her standing over a narrow crevice where the ground had dropped away. A newborn calf from another cow had slipped down there during the chaos. Moth had spent the entire night blocking the wind with her body. She kicked me twice when I tried to lift the calf, but she never moved from that spot until both of us were safe. Braa took a slow sip of water. "I never sold her. Some debts aren't measured in money." Her words settled between us like dust after a long ride. I felt the weight of them, not pity, not admiration, just the quiet recognition that she had chosen to keep something the world would have written off. For the first time, I wondered what it cost her to stand so steady when everything around her tried to shift. November arrived with a sudden cold snap that stripped the last leaves from the cottonwoods. I found Braa and two workers wrestling a section of fence that had toppled in the night wind. A steel post leaned at a dangerous angle, ready to drag the whole line down. I didn't wait for an invitation. I grabbed a post driver and stepped in. The ground was half frozen, the work dirty and immediate. Sweat cooled fast on my back. When the last wire was stretched tight, one of the hands, an elf with calloused fingers, gave me a sideways look. Thought traders stuck to paperwork. I shrugged, flexing sore shoulders. "Paperwork doesn't hold a fence up." Braa wiped dirt from her hands and jerked her chin toward the house. "Wash up. Coffee's hot." Inside, she handed me a towel and a mug. Steam curled between us, while I told her about a summer years back, when my father and I met an old dwarf selling knives at a roadside stand. The dwarf had said a good blade serves the task it was made for and refuses anything else. My father bought the ugliest knife on the table simply because it fit his grip perfectly. He used it for everything, opening crates, trimming rope, slicing apples, never once for show. Braa listened, then set her mug down. "I once bought a pickup because it looked impressive. Red paint-lifted suspension engine that growled like it had opinions. Drove it 3 months before I sold it at a loss. It couldn't carry the kind of load my life actually required." She said it plainly without embarrassment. The admission cracked something open in the space between us, not romance, just the relief of two people who had both made choices that looked foolish on paper yet taught them the same lesson. I left that day carrying the image of her standing in the yard, wind tugging at her braid, the kind of steady presence that made the land itself seem more solid. December brought snow earlier than anyone expected. I had to engage the truck's lower gears just to reach the farm. When I pulled in, Braa's older pickup sat in the yard with a flat tire and a bent rim from hidden ice. She was already kneeling beside it, jacket-dusted white breath fogging the air. I grabbed the jack without a word. We worked shoulder to shoulder on the frozen concrete fingers, numb tools clinking against metal. By the time the spare was mounted, the sky had gone the color of slate and the road out was worse than when I arrived. "You're not driving back tonight," she said. It wasn't a question. "Couch in the front room is long enough." I stayed. The house was quiet except for the wood stove's soft crackle. We sat at opposite ends of the sofa with mugs of strong tea between us. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt earned. After a while, she spoke into the low light. When I first bought this place, I was 32. A Wolfpack owner offered to buy the southern section at twice what it was worth. I refused. 2 months later, my best hands were poached with better wages. The pump system was sabotaged at night. The bank changed loan terms without warning. Everyone said a lone orc woman couldn't hold ground like this. She stared into the fire. I slept 4 hours a night for 3 straight months, sold the only piece of jewelry my mother left me, hauled water by hand for the herd when the wells ran low. I sued the bank and won. But there were nights I wanted nothing more than someone to stand beside me and say I could be tired for one damn day. Her voice never wavered, yet I heard the years behind every syllable. I didn't offer comfort or empty promises. I simply sat there, letting the story rest between us like another log on the fire. That night, lying on the couch under a heavy blanket that smelled faintly of hay and cedar, I realized I was no longer counting the miles back to the city. I was already thinking about the next trip here. January opened with the town's early year market. I finished deliveries early and spotted Braa at a stall buying new rope and padlocks for the western pens. A cluster of half-drunk men at the next booth were talking loud enough for the whole square to hear. Thorne land will fall eventually. Just a matter of time before that orc woman gets tired of fighting alone. Braa kept her back turned, measuring chain links with steady hands. I stepped closer to the group before my brain caught up with my feet. "You talking about my customer?" I asked, voice even. One of them smirked. "Everyone knows no," I cut in. "I asked what you called her." The calm in my tone did more than shouting ever could. They muttered something and drifted away. Braa set the rope down and looked at me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "I could have handled it." "I know." She studied my face like she was reading a map she hadn't expected to need. This is the first time I've let someone speak for me without feeling like I owed them something afterward. The words were small, almost offhand, but they landed with surprising weight. On the drive back to the farm, I kept turning them over. By the time we reached her porch, the sky had begun spitting sleet. I didn't linger for coffee this time. The road was already turning treacherous. Yet, as I pulled away, I caught myself glancing in the mirror longer than necessary, watching the house shrink behind me. 4 months. 4 short visits. A handful of stories traded like coins passed between careful hands. Nothing dramatic had happened. No grand gestures, no confessions under starlight. Yet something inside me had shifted by fractions so small, I almost missed them. Each time I left Stone Creek, I carried a little more of Braa's quiet strength with me, and each time I returned, I found myself looking forward to the next exchange before the current one had even ended. The road no longer felt like an obligation. It was beginning to feel like a thread pulling me back to the same place month after month, for reasons I still refuse to name out loud. February arrived with a wind that scraped across the plains like sandpaper drying the ground until every hoofprint turned to dust. I made the run a day early, telling myself it was to drop off 2 extra cases of antiseptic I claimed had been over-ordered. The real reason sat heavier in my chest, the way the previous months had begun to stretch the hours between visits into something I didn't want to examine too closely. Stone Creek lay quiet under a pale sky when I pulled in. Braa stood near the southern fence line with a man I had never seen before. His SUV, black, polished out of place, sat on the dirt track like an ink stain. The stranger wore a pressed vest and boots too clean for the work around here. Cole Maddox. I had heard the name in town, always spoken with the careful tone people use when money and ambition mix. I killed the engine and walked over without hurrying. Braa's shoulders were set in the rigid line I had come to recognize as her version of braced for impact. She didn't turn when I approached, but the slight shift in her stance told me she knew I was there. Cole offered a smile that looked practiced. "Vale, good timing. I was just discussing a proposal that could benefit the entire county." Braa spoke before I could answer, her voice flat and final. "He's here to deliver supplies, not to listen to land deals." Cole kept his eyes on me anyway. "You travel these routes. You see how the new highway will change everything. A logistics hub on the southern section would bring jobs, infrastructure, real growth. Your father understood progress." I set the cases down on the concrete. My father understood keeping his word to the people who paid on time. That's what I understand too. Braca's gaze flicked to me for half a second, long enough to register the support without asking for it, then returned to Cole. The answer is still no. I'm not selling any part of this land. Cole exhaled through his nose, the sound almost amused. You're too sharp to let emotion cloud a good offer. Keep the name on the deed if it matters. I handle expansion. You keep the ranch identity. Everyone wins. There is no everyone in your version, she said. Only who loses first and who collects later. Cole studied her a moment longer, then glanced at me again, as if measuring whether I might sway her. I met his eyes without blinking. He finally nodded, once climbed back into the SUV and drove off in a low cloud of dust that lingered like a threat. Braca watched the vehicle disappear before she spoke. You didn't have to step in. I know. I picked up one case and started toward the shed, but I was already here. She walked beside me in silence. The work went quickly after that, stocking shelves, checking inventory, but the air between us felt thicker now, charged with the knowledge that someone outside had drawn a line across her property and expected her to step aside. 2 weeks later, the trouble sharpened. I was back in the city reviewing ledgers late at night when my phone lit up with her number. The message was short. Camera files won't load. Need help tonight. Not a delivery day. The timestamp read 11:47. I grabbed my laptop and drove straight back, the highway empty under a thin moon. Braca met me at the gate wearing the same jacket from earlier in the day, now dusted with fresh dirt. Her braid had loosened at the edges. Fence on the south pasture was cut. 37 head got out onto the county road. Nearly caused a wreck with a cement truck. Camera caught 2 figures on dirt bikes. I can't pull the footage right. We went inside without wasting words. The kitchen table became a workspace, laptop open, coffee poured black and strong. For the next 3 hours, we sat side by side, scrolling through grainy night vision clips, enlarging blurry plates, noting the make of the bikes that matched equipment Maddox's crews used. She spoke only when necessary, pointing at timestamps, her shoulder occasionally brushing mine when we both leaned in. The house felt smaller in the quiet, the weight of the day pressing down around us. By 2 in the morning, the sheriff's report was filed, and the files backed up on a separate drive. Outside, the wind had died to nothing. Inside, only the refrigerator hummed, and our breathing filled the pauses. Braca rubbed her eyes with the heel of her hand. Your turn to talk first tonight. I don't want the last thing in my head before sleep to be cut wire and running cattle. I leaned back in the chair, searching for something that fit the moment. When I was 19, I got into it with a store owner who shorted us on a delivery. I was angry enough to drop the price on the next load just to close the deal fast. Lost money for 3 months fixing it. My father didn't yell. He made me copy one sentence on the back of every old invoice for the rest of the week. A man who's mad always thinks he's thinking clearly. She gave a short, dry sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Smart man. He was. Until the anger passed and I saw how much I had cost us, I thought I was being decisive. Braca stared at the dark window for a long time. I once had a banker come around when I was 39, polite flowers on the porch, compliments on how well I ran the place alone. Said he admired a woman who didn't need saving. 6 months later, he asked if I'd consider putting the southern parcel into a joint account after we married. Easier for the future, he said. She traced a crack in the wooden table with one thick finger. I told him my future didn't require easy handling. He left the same night. 2 weeks after that, my supplier started tightening credit terms. Coincidence, I'm sure. The story sat between us, raw and unpolished. I didn't reach for her hand or offer hollow reassurance. I simply stayed in the chair, letting her words have the space they needed. For the first time, I understood that the trust building here wasn't about grand declarations. It was about choosing to remain when the easier choice was to drive away. Braca stood eventually and pulled a spare blanket from the hall closet. Couch is yours again if you want it. Road still iced over in patches. I accepted without argument. As she turned toward the stairs, she paused at the doorway back to me. Adrian? Yeah. She didn't face me. I don't usually let people see the mess before it's cleaned up. Tonight, I did. Then she continued upstairs, footsteps quiet on the old boards. I lay on the couch later, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the house settle around me. The southern pasture, the cut fence, Cole Maddox's polished smile, they all circled in my mind like loose cattle. But underneath that noise ran a steadier current, the simple fact that when she had needed someone at nearly midnight on a night that wasn't mine to claim, she had called me. I still refused to name what was growing between the stories we traded and the silences we kept. Naming it would make it real, and real things could be taken away. For now, it was enough to feel the slow tug of the road pulling me back here month after month, stronger than any schedule or obligation my father had ever left behind. March brought the kind of spring that lied without shame. 3 warm days fooled the grass into pushing up tender shoots, then a cold front swept down from the north and turned everything brittle again. I made the run on schedule, the truck loaded with the usual supplies, plus a few extra fence posts I had loaded on my own time. Braa met me at the equipment shed, her sleeves already dark with sweat from morning chores. We worked side by side without needing many words. Later at the kitchen table, she spread open the ranch ledger and slid it toward me. Not for advice, she said, just so someone else can see how ridiculous this supplier quote looks. I scanned the columns, the numbers steady under my finger. She had circled one line in red feed costs up 23% with no explanation. I listened while she broke down every expense, her voice low and precise. When she finished, I told her about the summer I turned 21, and my father made me balance the entire route books by hand for a month because I had misread one invoice and cost us $400. He never raised his voice. He simply handed me the ledger and said, mistakes that cost money should cost time too. Braa closed the book with a soft thud. Your father taught you the weight of small errors. He taught me that numbers don't lie the way people do. She looked at me across the table for a long moment, then nodded once as if filing the thought away somewhere safe. April followed the same careful pattern. The days lengthened, the wind carried pollen instead of dust, and I found myself noticing small changes at Stone Creek, the new sensor on the main water line, the way she had started leaving 2 mugs on the back porch rail before my truck even appeared. One afternoon, she asked me to help check the irrigation timers. We crouched together in the mud shoulders brushing, while she explained the cycle settings. I told her about the dwarf knife seller again, only this time I added how my father kept that ugly blade in the glove box for 15 years because it fit his hand and never once failed him. Braa listened, then admitted she had once kept a horse that bucked everyone except her simply because it reminded her of her own stubbornness. The stories were becoming a bridge we crossed without naming it. Each visit left me driving away with a quieter mind, the road feeling less like a duty and more like a return. Then, June arrived dry as bone and twice as mean. I was in town loading a small order of pump seals when the first column of smoke rose behind the northern hills. Lightning had struck the previous night in the high grass, no rain, only sparks. By the time I reached the county road, the sky had turned the color of old ash. Sirens wailed in the distance. I didn't think. I simply turned the truck west towards Stone Creek. The farm was already in motion when I arrived. Braa sat high on a gray horse, shouting orders to her crew. Smoke hung low, thick enough to sting the eyes. The northern pasture glowed orange along its edge. I parked, grabbed the spare fire pack I kept behind the seat, and ran to join them. We worked without pause. I drove the small water tender up and down the fire line, dragging hoses while Naren and 2 other hands beat back flames with wet burlap. Braa moved everywhere at once, directing, hauling, never stopping. Her shirt clung dark with sweat and soot. Ash coated her braid. At one point, a sudden gust pushed the fire toward the equipment shed. A sheet of corrugated metal tore loose from the roof, spinning downward like a dull blade. I saw it before she did. I lunged, caught her arm, and yanked her sideways. The metal slammed into the ground exactly where she had been standing, edge buried deep in the dirt. For 3 full seconds, my hand stayed locked around hers, calloused palm against calloused palm grip, tight enough to bruise. Neither of us spoke. Then the moment broke. She pulled free, and we kept moving, the heat and noise swallowing everything else. By nightfall, the fire was out. Stone Creek stood. But 40 acres of prime grazing land lay blackened and smoking, and the small hay barn on the ridge was gone. We sat on the back porch steps, faces streaked gray boots, heavy with ash. Braa drank from a plastic bottle, then passed it to me without a word. The silence between us felt different now, thicker, carved out by shared exhaustion. 2 weeks later, the second blow landed. An anonymous complaint reached the county office claiming Stone Creek's fire had spread onto public land and damaged a section of the main gravel road. At the same time, the bank sent a formal letter reviewing Braa's long-term loan, citing elevated environmental risk after the blaze. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Maddox's fingerprints were invisible, but unmistakable. I drove to the farm the same afternoon I heard the news, no delivery scheduled, no excuse prepared. I found Braa at the kitchen table surrounded by paperwork, shoulders set in the rigid line I had come to know too well. She looked up when I walked in but didn't speak. I opened the refrigerator without asking, pulled out what I could find: cold roast, sharp cheese, dark bread, a jar of mustard, and built two thick sandwiches on the counter. Nothing fancy, just enough to put something real in her stomach. I set a plate in front of her. Eat. She stared at the food for a long moment, then picked it up and took a bite. We sat across from each other while the clock on the wall ticked through the quiet. After the second sandwich was half gone, she set it down and looked straight at me. Why do you keep coming back here, Adrian? This isn't your fight. It never was. I turned the empty plate slowly between my hands, searching for words that wouldn't cheapen the truth. At first it was because of my father. Then it was because I respected the way you hold this place together when everything tries to pull it apart. Now, I met her eyes. Now it's because if something happened to you or to Stone Creek, I wouldn't be able to tell myself it was just business. Not anymore. Braa didn't look away. The kitchen light caught the silver in her braid and the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, marks of years I had not lived through. She spoke after a long silence. When I was 39, a man started coming around. Clean suit, easy smile, worked for the town council. He said he admired a woman who built something strong. He brought flowers. He listened when I talked about water rights and feed prices. 6 months later, he asked if I would consider putting the southern pasture into both our names after we married. Said it would make the future simpler. She traced a scar on the wooden table with one thick finger. I told him my future had never needed simplifying. He left that same night. 2 weeks later, 3 of my best suppliers changed their terms without warning. I fought it the only way I knew how, by staying on my feet longer than anyone expected. But there were nights I wondered what it would feel like to have someone stand beside me without calculating what my land was worth. The story settled between us like the ash that still lingered outside. I didn't reach across the table. I didn't offer promises. I simply stayed in the chair, letting the weight of her words rest exactly where they belonged. Outside, the evening wind moved through the surviving pasture, carrying the faint smell of charred earth. Inside, the refrigerator hummed and the clock kept its steady count. Neither of us named what had grown between the stories we traded and the silences we shared. Naming it would make it fragile. For now, it was enough to sit in the same room, two people who had learned the hard way that some things are only proven by showing up when the fire comes and the bills arrive and the world waits for you to break. I still didn't know what to call it. I only knew the road that had once belonged to my father now led me here again and again because something stronger than habit waited at the end of it. August slipped away in a haze of paperwork and quiet preparation. I spent 3 nights going through every box my father had left behind, searching for anything that might help. In the bottom drawer of the old oak chest he kept in the garage beneath layers of faded invoices and route logs, I found a thick manila folder bound with a rusted metal clip. The label on the front, written in his familiar slanted hand, read simply, Black Creek. Don't overlook this one. Inside were copies of land surveys from 2012, original boundary photographs, time-stamped security stills from the county road cameras, and handwritten notes detailing every visit Maddox's crews had made to the southern edge of Stone Creek. One page carried a single underlined sentence: if they ever try to move the markers again, unwell. These prove the aquifer and the access road have always belonged to Thorne land. My father had known. He had quietly gathered proof for years, never mentioning it to me, never using it unless the moment demanded. I sat on the cold concrete floor of the garage until the sky outside turned gray, the folder heavy in my lap like an inheritance I had never asked for but now understood completely. The next morning I drove straight to Stone Creek without calling ahead. Braa was checking the herd in the eastern pasture. When she saw my truck, she rode over, dismounted, and walked beside me to the house without questions. I laid the folder open on her kitchen table. She stood over it for a long time, turning each page slowly, her thick fingers pausing on my father's handwriting. When she reached the final note, her shoulders dropped a fraction, the only sign that something inside her had shifted. He kept this, she said quietly, for years. She looked up at me. You're taking this to the county hearing next week. We're taking it, I corrected. Braa studied my face the way she studied a new piece of equipment, measuring, calculating risk. Then she nodded once. All right. The hearing room smelled of old wood and strong coffee. Cole Maddox sat at the far end of the long table with his lawyer wearing the same polished vest and confident smile he had brought to the farm months earlier. When I walked in carrying the folder, he glanced at me, then at Braa beside me, and the smile tightened at the corners. The proceedings moved slowly at first, maps projected on the wall, statements read aloud, technical terms thrown around like shields. Maddox's side presented their case with neat charts and projections of economic growth. Then it was our turn. I stood and placed the 2012 survey on the table, followed by the camera stills, followed by my father's notes. Braa spoke only when asked, her voice steady as she confirmed dates and incidents. She never raised her tone, she didn't need to. The evidence did the work. Maddox tried to pivot, his lawyer objecting smoothly, but the county officials had already begun to look at the documents with different eyes. By the time the session ended 4 hours later, the complaint against Stone Creek had been dismissed. The boundary markers ordered resurveyed at Maddox's expense, and an investigation into his company's practices quietly opened. Outside the building, the sky had turned the color of wet slate. A rare September rain began to fall, fat drops slapping against the warm pavement and raising the scent of damp earth. We stood under the narrow overhang at the top of the steps, neither of us moving toward the truck. Rain drummed on the metal roof above us, steady and clean. Braa watched the water sheet down the street. We won. I nodded. We did. She turned to face me then, the silver threads in her braid catching the gray light. Water beaded on her shoulders and ran down the leather cord at her wrist. I felt the months of careful distance between us compress into something immediate and undeniable. Braa, I said, and the name felt different on my tongue, now heavier with everything we had carried unspoken. I don't know exactly when it stopped being about the route or about my father. Maybe it was the first time you told me about digging that well. Maybe it was the night you called me at 2 in the morning because the fence was cut. Or maybe it started earlier, the day I realized I was checking the calendar every month just to count the days until I could drive through your gate again. I took a breath. All I know is that if I keep pretending this is still only business, I'm lying to both of us. Rain fell harder, loud enough to swallow any small sounds. Braa didn't look away. Her eyes held mine the way they had the very first morning measuring, but this time without the armor. She spoke after a long silence, voice low beneath the downpour. Your turn to listen now. I waited. The first time your father delivered to Stone Creek, I was 30. The bank had just tightened my loan and 3 good hands had walked away for better pay. I was standing on that same back porch, wondering how long I could keep pretending I wasn't drowning. Henry set down the boxes, poured himself a cup of coffee without being asked, and said one sentence, "People only tell a woman to sell what she built with her own sweat, when they believe her sweat is lighter than theirs." Then he drank his coffee and left. Every month after that, he came back, told one story, and made me tell one in return. He never offered to fix anything. He just showed up on time. That was enough to keep me standing until I could stand on my own again. She took one step closer, close enough that I could see individual raindrops clinging to her lashes. You're not him, she continued, but you kept showing up the same way, even when it wasn't your fight. Even when the easier choice was to stay on the main road and never turn west. I lifted my hand slowly, giving her every chance to move away. She didn't. My fingers brushed hers, then closed around them, warm, rough, familiar now in a way that felt inevitable. Braa's grip answered, steady and certain. I'm not asking you to change, I said. I'm not asking for easy. I just want to keep coming back here because it's where I want to be, not because the calendar says it's delivery day. She looked down at our joined hands for a moment, then back up. The corner of her mouth lifted in the smallest, most genuine expression I had ever seen from her. Then, hear this, Adrian Vale. Stone Creek is still mine. And the man standing here in the rain with me? She paused, letting the words settle. He's someone I've decided I want to keep seeing at the start of every month and every day in between if he chooses to stay. The rain fell around us like a curtain. I closed the last small distance between us and kissed her slow and hurried nothing like the stories people tell about sudden passion. It tasted of rain and coffee and years of careful restraint finally released. Her free hand came up to rest against the side of my neck thumb, brushing the line of my jaw, once then staying there. When we drew apart, neither of us spoke right away. We simply stood under the overhang while the world continued its steady pour. Weeks turned into months. Black Creek talked, of course. Age differences, land motives, the usual small-town gossip that eventually ran out of new fuel and moved on to the next thing. We let it roll past us like wind over the pastures. I still made the route every first week of the month, but I also came on the days in between, sometimes with spare parts, sometimes with nothing but a fresh bag of coffee beans. Braa kept a second mug on the top shelf of the kitchen cupboard, now the brown ceramic one that fit my hands exactly. Some evenings we sat on the back porch and traded stories again. The old rhythm, unbroken only now the silences between them carried a different weight. One clear October evening, a full year after that first solo delivery, I parked the truck in its usual spot and found her waiting on the porch steps. The pond caught the last of the sunset, turning the water the color of polished brass. I walked up and sat beside her without needing an invitation. She bumped her shoulder against mine, a small, deliberate contact that had become our shorthand for many things. "Your turn first tonight," she said. I smiled into the quiet. There was once a man who thought he was only following the road his father left behind. Then one day he realized the road had been leading him to the same place all along, and that place had started leading him back. Braa leaned her head slightly towards me, braid brushing my arm. "My turn." I waited. There was once a woman who believed the only things worth holding were land and water and fences strong enough to last. Then one day, she looked out her gate at the start of every month and understood she wasn't waiting for supplies anymore. She was waiting for one particular truck and the man who drove it to come home. I reached over and took her hand. The leather cord on her wrist pressed warm against my skin. Somewhere beyond the porch, the cattle lowed softly as they moved toward the night pasture. The road stretched out behind me, empty now, but I knew it would still be there when the next month came. For the first time in my life, the route felt exactly long enough to bring me where I needed to be.